Hello and welcome to Coffee and Conversation. I'm your host, Shashank Bengali. I'm here with Katitza Rodríguez. She's the International Rights Director at the Electronic Frontier Foundation, which is a nonprofit. Katitza, thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
So many countries now are using Chinese technology companies like Huawei or ZTE, for example, to set up surveillance systems in various places. They call it a smart city or a safe city program. They say to either make commerce easier or to improve security, to fight crime. Do you see concerns being raised about how enhancing security is a cover for increasing surveillance like in urban areas or in protest zones? How do people weigh the right to safety and security versus the right to privacy?
Yeah, smart cities per se are not a problem. It's the use of certain technologies that will be problematic. We measure these technologies first to know whether there is a legitimate use of the data and whether its use is necessary and proportionate. But it's more about the balance, It's about making sure that you are using certain technologies in particular cases without any suspicion of any wrongdoing. The idea and the problems that we have is when these technologies are imposed by default in society to track all the population so the data can be used in the future if a crime is committed. This means that everyone, all the population, will be suspicion by default because all the data is being recorded. When they use technologies like facial recognition, these technologies tracks everyone in the street and who passed through a CCTV camera and is able to identify that person. To be able to do that, they have to record everyone who is passing in the street and match it to an existing database that they have. It's a mass surveillance technology that we said is disproportionate because it just captures the data of innocent individual before they commit any wrongdoing.
Let me ask you about, for example, Chinese companies. Well, I mentioned Huawei and ZTE, which are two major providers of surveillance camera equipment and technology equipment around the world. Very technologically advanced, in many ways the gold standard for a lot of this equipment. And yet there are accusations by the US and by other governments that these companies could have links to the Chinese Communist Party, could be backdoors for state surveillance, so that the data collected by the companies in these other countries could be used for spying by the Chinese government. We've seen India now recently ban a bunch of Chinese apps, including TikTok and WeChat, because they feel they're security threats. We've seen the US, of course, try to ban Huawei and ZTE for the same reason. We now see technology companies becoming geopolitical pawns. How does that change the advocacy work that EFF does? Because you're now not going beyond technology, you're going into the realm of geopolitics and strategy.
We focus more on the surveillance measure. So in this case, mass surveillance technology like facial recognition. We have tracked the use of these technologies that even Ecuador and Bolivia have been acquiring these technologies. And in addition, also some of our partners were able to identify the Serbian government was acquiring these technologies also in their country. What is interesting is that it's becoming like a little trade war. These acquisitions and technology come also with financial support in developing countries where there are not a strong civil society.
We're in this pandemic world now, and a lot of people have been, I think, willing to tolerate a bit more intrusiveness by the state. How can we ensure that these kind of shifting privacy boundaries reset after the crisis? Or do you think that now the governments have become used to certain types of data being, in their back pocket, they may not want to go back, or they may make it challenging to reset these norms?
One of the main concerns that I have is this change of narrative, where people get accustomed that surveillance is something of your day-to-day. I think that our role in society right now is to try to call attention about all the risks the abuse of data can cause to citizens in the future, vis-a-vis insurance, vis-a-vis not only abused by the government but also by the private sector. That's what we are doing right now, trying to call attention to the general user, how the technology works, who will have access to the data, for which purpose, for how long. We are still in the middle of the crisis. We still need to force social distancing, but we need to make sure that technology is only supporting the real work that health ministries are doing to contain the virus. Technology cannot replace manual contact tracing. It has to be a support. To make sure that when the pandemic is over, this is hard. At that moment in time, we will have to start writing a game to see whether that happened or not, if the data have been deleted. We need to prepare that if in the future we have another pandemic, all the legal framework is in place, and we are making sure that the use of data is done in a proportionate, necessary way. So yeah, there is a lot of things, and it's very challenging to be able to monitor all of the technologies, but we will have to wait to see whether those measures will be rolled back. And we hope that with the work we are doing, this narrative about we need to live in a surveillance by default doesn't win. And we are more conscious actually about the use of our data. And this is what we're seeing right now in the news. Many people are not adopting these contact tracing apps because of fear of the use of the data by the government. So that's why we need this kind of legislation to make sure that our privacy is protected.
The technology is only as good as the laws surrounding it, so that people feel confident in giving up their data, because we've seen, here in Singapore, where the government's tried to introduce contact tracing apps, the uptake has not been that great, and the government has been unwilling to make it mandatory because they know there will be some pushback to that. They're not getting a lot of voluntary buy-in as much as they need to make the apps worthwhile. So it really is quite crucial for governments to see that and to recognize that a legal framework is really important. Do you think governments are recognizing that, or is it still a matter of we're in the middle of this crisis, we've got to get everything we can in our toolkit to solve it?
I think there's still a need to prove the efficacy of the tools for contact tracing, and I think that trust is key. And right now, with all the abuses of our data collection practices, people don't trust, and that's why people are not adopting these technologies. So right now, we need to see serious commitment from governments and companies to respect and to protect our data. We have to consent to it. It has to be informed consent, so I know what I'm agreeing with, and should be deleted after the pandemic. Right now, a lot of laws be discussed around COVID, and there are also other discussions in other countries when they try to extend who can access the data, because the exceptions and data protection laws in countries with data protection laws is for medical and health purposes. And so other entities of the government cannot access that data. In some countries, there is an exception where you don't need consent for accessing the data to curb the pandemic, but it's very limited. Some people want to expand that to cover other entities who have access to the data. So it's still a debate. It's not clear, and I hope that the reality, the fact that people are not using the system, tell the governments, tell the companies, it's time for you to be serious about protecting our data and be clear about what you are doing with it, and making sure it's secure and people don't, and it's not being abused. Privacy is this right that is very hard to see how these entities are managing our data, but we will have to see it. Anytime there is a data breach and a scandal, we learn more about how they have been handling our data. So we have to wait a little bit to see.
That's a great place to end on, Katitza. Thank you so much for joining us. That's all the time we have for today here on Coffee and Conversation. I'm your host, Shashank Bengali. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.